Daniel chapter 2. We are working our way through, and we're kind of got halfway through the second chapter, and we're not stalling, but we're going to be here on at least one more message. Remember, we're at a time period in Israel's history where Israel as a nation is ceased to exist for all practical purposes. It was after the divided kingdom. It was after that Assyria overtook the northern kingdom, and then 20 years later, that the southern kingdom, which was Judah, was taken over by Babylon, and they, as a nation state, ceased to exist and have never returned anything like they would have been under Solomon or under David. And even in 1948, when they returned as a nation, not the nation yet that the Lord promised it would be. And Daniel comes onto the scene right at the beginning of a prophesied captivity. A captivity that was there because they didn't listen to God. They didn't listen to what God had done with Israel, the northern 10 tribes. They didn't listen as God said, I'm going to destroy you as a nation if you continue on this path. And they did, and so God did. And Judah followed that path and ended up in the same place. So, as Babylon is taking over the region, they exile different ones, and Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're taken in, and several others, remember, and they're reprogrammed, and they're put in positions of power to be liaisons between the Chaldean government and the children of Israel that remain. And they reprogram them in an effort to wipe out their Hebrew history. Daniel comes onto the scene right as a young man, teenager, in that time period that Nebuchadnezzar, and in a couple of years Nebuchadnezzar takes over full reign because his father passes away, and Nebuchadnezzar is the sole monarch. And that's key for tonight. Nebuchadnezzar was the sole monarch of Babylon. Well, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. You remember this. And in that dream, he was very startled. He called urgently all of the brain trust of the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, all the people that normally study dreams, and helped interpret what the dream meant. Now, I don't understand why Daniel, who was stated to have the wisdom of God upon him, Nebuchadnezzar knew that, and found in chapter 1 and verse 20 the wisdom of Daniel and his three friends 10 times better than all the magicians, astrologers that were in his realm. And so I don't know, I can't put the pieces all together why that Daniel wasn't called in the first round of trying to interpret the dream, except for this, that God orchestrated that, because when the dream was forgotten, when Nebuchadnezzar gets his brain trust of brainiac people that's going to interpret this dream, and he says, by the way, I don't know what the dream was. So before you can interpret it, you have to tell me what it was, and then interpret the dream. And they said, nobody does that. And he said, listen, I'll cut you all up into pieces, make your houses a dunghill if you can't interpret the dream. So this is pretty serious. The king is I don't think that's hyperbole that he'll kill them. I think that's what he was going to do, because Daniel advocated not to kill them if I can interpret the dream. And so that's the situation where we left. We left as we brought to your attention that in the dream, what Nebuchadnezzar saw was an image, and we'll describe that image again. And what he saw was 4 successive empires Not successful necessarily, successive, one after another, empires. And that represents what the Lord called the time of the Gentiles. Israel as a nation, the way that anybody understood Israel to be as a sovereign nation, was gone. And the global dominance was Gentile until the return of the Lord, and He sets up His kingdom in the millennial reign. And it will be a sovereign domination of God and His people. But Nebuchadnezzar, a pagan king, sees the times of the Gentiles. And that starts with him. We'll see that again tonight. He was the head of the image. And so it reminds me that nations come and nations go. I think, and I don't consider myself a pessimist. I consider myself a realist. I think our country, as we know it, is pretty well gone. As we knew it and as it was founded, is pretty well gone. I think we've crossed the get back on ramp. And I think it's going to go downhill. I could be wrong, and there could be brief reprieves here and there, but by and large, we're not the Christian nation as founded. And that's all of God. Nations rise, nations fall. Israel rose. Israel was disobedient, and they got away from the principles of God, and they fell. America was built on the principles of God. They were strong, and then got away from the principles of God, and it's going to crumble. It's just a matter of time. Evil men shall wax worse and worse. And so Acts 17:26 says that God determined the times and seasons of the nations. So this is of no surprise whatsoever. God is in control of all these things. So starting in verse 28 of Daniel 2, Daniel says, "But there's a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known unto the king, Nebuchadnezzar, what shall be in the latter days." It's a phrase that talks about eschatology. It's an eschatological phrase that talks about things to come. And Nebuchadnezzar saw that. And he says, what shall be in the latter days? Thy dream and thy visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. And then he says something that must... I remember last week I made mention that Nebuchadnezzar, once Daniel starts talking, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't say a thing. That's recorded through telling him what the dream was and then giving him the interpretation. Nebuchadnezzar is completely silent. Think about this. Nebuchadnezzar is asking them, demanding of them, or I'll cut you into little pieces, make your house a manure pile. He's demanding of them that you tell me what the dream was. I mean, that's interesting. Many a night that people dream and they forget it the next morning, and you can go to your spouse and say, I dreamed something last night. What was it? And, I don't know. And Daniel will tell him what his dream was. But more than that, verse 29, as for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter? Daniel even told the king what he was thinking as he drifted off to sleep. Only the king and God knew that. Don't you think that got the king's attention? Nebuchadnezzar is like, what? The man knows what I was, and he's right? Nebuchadnezzar's all ears. He's nothing to say. He's just listening. Thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter? And he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. He's telling you, you're a normal, self-absorbed monarch, and you wonder, how long's my kingdom going to last? Who's going to take it down? Will I live to see it taken down? And I think probably in his arrogance, he didn't dream that he would live to see it come down. And he didn't. It lasted long. Interestingly, that the kingdom as a whole, in this state of monarch kind of sovereignty, lasted, guess how long? About 70 years. The 70 years that God had prepared them to keep Israel captive. And then Cyrus and the Persians take over, and they fall, and they're there 70 years, just the time that God needed them to be there. Verse 30, Daniel's humble about it. He said, as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. Thou, O king, and now we'll just rehearse this. We looked at it last week. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. We would think of the word as awesome, amazing. Not terribly frightening, but amazing. And so the image was large. The image was brilliant, and the light refracted off of it in all directions. The image, but the king sawest, and behold, a great image, this great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. We'll also see that it was the form of a man. And the image head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet and part iron and part clay. And we made the observation last week that the gold is the heaviest, and as it gets lighter as it goes down, gets more brittle as it goes down. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron and the clay and the brass and the silver and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floor. And the wind carried them away, and there's no place found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. Now the stone that smote the image and filled the whole earth, we're going to really, Lord willing, delve into that next week. But so you have a man, head of gold, breast and arms of silver. You have that extra weight on top. You have brittle underpinnings, foundations, if you will, with the legs and feet of iron, and then an iron mixture with clay. And so it's the image of a man, and then this stone that no hands cut out rose up, destroyed the image, turned it to dust, and then the stone became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the dream. And right now Nebuchadnezzar's going, wow, that was the dream. And we will tell thee the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings. It does not say he is the king of kings. He is telling him he is a king of kings. He was a monarch of monarchs. He was the sovereign of sovereigns. He is not the sovereign of sovereigns. But you, Nebuchadnezzar, of all the kings on the earth, you're the king of kings. You're one of those that has risen above. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. Daniel is quick to point that out, that you have this because God gave it to you. Nebuchadnezzar should have listened to that. Verses 30. And again, remember that sole monarchy. That will factor in very prevalent here in a second. So you're king of kings. God hath given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. So he's dominated the region, and he's going to tell him and show him that he could dominate even more. And the kingdom projects power and strength and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he, God, given into thine hand, and hath made thee a ruler over them all. Thou, Nebuchadnezzar, art this head of gold. What this image will represent is the time of the Gentiles, the things that will come and reach all the way to the latter days. What the thing that he saw was the time of the Gentiles, and him being the monarch that was represented by the head. And I think it was him as the king of the Babylonian kingdom. I think this is successive kingdoms, and as he's describing it, he's calling him out as the monarch of the Babylonian kingdom. But that head of gold is the starting point of the times of the Gentiles. And Nebuchadnezzar, that's you. That starts with you. And remember, whithersoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air, or fowls of the heaven, hath he given unto thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior. Now, this has given a lot of people a lot of questions. Some of the successive kingdoms, some of the kingdoms that were to follow, and the next one was the Medo-Persian kingdom. So many of them covered more territory and lasted longer. And they say, how was he inferior then? Well, I believe what it has reference to was that as the king of Babylon, he was the last sole monarch of any of the kingdoms represented in this image. And obviously there are kingdoms with sole monarchs, but not global dominance like these kingdoms. And these kingdoms that had global dominance, we're going to deal with Alexander the Great and the Greeks. He thought he conquered the world. It's global dominance. But Alexander the Great had several sovereigns in his realm. It wasn't a sole monarchy. Neither was the Medo-Persian Empire. And so I believe what he's saying when he's saying, well, a couple of things. It makes me smile a little bit. Okay, this is the king. If you don't tell me the dream, I'm going to cut you into little pieces and make your house a manure pile. How bold is Daniel going to be? How blunt is Daniel going to be? You're the king of kings, man. You rise above the top. You rise above all the rest. And the kingdom that takes over after your kingdom is an inferior kingdom. That makes me smile a little bit. It's also true. Daniel's not lying, obviously. But it makes me smile a little bit that it shows a little tact as he eases Nebuchadnezzar into the idea, your kingdom's not lasting forever. You're not going to last forever. And your kingdom's not going to last forever. And the one that takes over, just by the way, is inferior. And I believe what that has reference to is that this was the last global power that was a sole monarch. And the Medo-Persian would have been a global power, but not solely run by a single king. And so here's the interpretation. At the end of verse 38, thou art this head of gold. And after thee, verse 39, shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee. So after thee will arise another kingdom. Now what did we have after? As you start at the top, and we've identified Nebuchadnezzar as the head of gold. A singular chunk of gold. Then you have the silver breast and arms, upper chest and arms. 2 arms, Medo-Persian. And we don't have to wonder that it represents the Medo-Persian Empire. History tells us that the Medo-Persian Empire succeeded after the Babylonian Empire. There's no question about that. Secular history tells us that. Biblical history tells us that. And so we don't have to wonder what the silver stood for. We don't have to wonder what the breast and 2 arms stood for. The Medo-Persian Empire was the next in line, and it's no accident that they were known for their stockpiles of silver. Secular history records that. And so in verse 39a, after you and your kingdom, there's another king. The kingdom Daniel serves down through Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. And so, or he at least is alive during that time. And so it's not focused solely on Nebuchadnezzar. The kingdom lasts beyond his lifetime. He was the sole monarch for 44 years, but it succeeded on beyond him. And after thee, a second kingdom, inferior. I think inferior because it was not a sole monarchy like you, Nebuchadnezzar, who is the king of kings. And then the latter part of verse 39, and then another third kingdom of brass. And that is the Greek Empire. And again, you don't have to really wonder what empire was next. Secular history tells us what empire was next. And with the brass, the Greek Empire and the Greek armies were known for their brass armaments and their brass, even weaponry, their prolific use of brass and bronze. And so it's no accident that their kingdom, their empire, is depicted with, verse 39, well, the brass up here was the belly and thighs of brass. And that would be the Greek Empire led by Alexander the Great. And so if you wonder how they came in, and every good reliable commentary is the same on what these various stages of this image represent and what the metals represent, it's not that hard to figure out, because secular history tells us that after the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire took over as the world dominating power, and after that the Greek Empire took over under Alexander the Great as a world dominating power. And then you have the last one, verse 40, the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, and that will represent the Roman Empire. And it was said that the Roman Empire, with their vast and tremendous military might, crushed people around them like iron. And notice what it says in verse 40, and the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these, shalt it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. And 10 toes divided into 10 segments. And there's all sorts of different people that have come up with all sorts of 10 divisions of Rome. I'm not worried about getting into identifying those things, but it's the Roman Empire. There's no question about that. It's the empire that took over as a global dominant power after the Greek Empire. Just secular history tells you that, and we know that God is giving Nebuchadnezzar an image that is telling his future, our history. And these are the things that he saw in the image, starting with the head that was him, and the chest and the arms of silver that was next after him. And you just take secular history and follow the global dominating powers, and you come up with these four kingdoms. And the time of the Gentiles just lives on. Israel never returns as a global power, as a kingdom with any kind of reputation at all. Israel in 1948 came back as a little sovereign state in a little tiny postage stamp, but nothing like what is prophesied for them in the future. And as verse 42, and as the toes of feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. So what you have in verse 42 is really the disintegration of the Roman Empire as a global dominance. Because, and he points it out in verse 43, they mingle themselves with the seed of men. They lose their tight-knit national identity. Remember Solomon. Solomon in all of his wisdom. And he married all of the wives and had the concubines, and a lot of that, we understand, was keeping up foreign relations with countries around him. Well, that caused him, the Bible tells us that caused Solomon to have his heart to stray. Marrying the strange women, in other words, the women from other countries, women from pagan societies, marrying them took his heart away from the singleness that it once had for God, and he lost his godly identity in many respects because of intermarrying with pagan women. As a nation, Rome is divided into these 10 parts. As a global dominance, they begin to lose their strong Roman identity because they marry these, and they intermarry with these, and intermarry with these, and it becomes a melting pot. And Rome as a global dominance, because of the intermarrying, just disintegrates, just glides off into the sunset. And he tells them, verse 43, this is what you saw was iron mixed with miry clay. They shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. And it wasn't like they had a moral prohibition against it. It wasn't like that we have a biblical prohibition against a believer marrying a non-believer. It wasn't like that. But they just, out of just normal living and relationships with those around him and national identities becoming more and more blurred, just began to marry. And so the Roman Empire isn't that sovereign entity that you can look at and say, there it is. There's its head. There's its king. But the time of the Gentiles lives on. Verse 44, in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. Notice, this is going to go all the way to the kingdom of God. This image will represent, Neb, you're the head, and Babylonian is your kingdom. That's the starting point. And it will go all the way till the Lord sets up his kingdom. Notice how it says this In the days of these kings, this time of the Gentiles is unfolding. In the days of these kings shall God, the God of heaven, set up a kingdom. There is no gap. There is the time of the Gentiles, and the Lord returns and sets up His kingdom. Even though the Babylonian government is long gone, as it is depicted as a sole global power. And then the Medo-Persian is long gone, as it was depicted as a sole global power. And the Greeks, as depicted as a sole global power, long gone. Rome just kind of disintegrated quietly by attrition. But the time of the Gentiles lives on until the Lord sets up a kingdom, verse 44, which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms that stand forever. And in that verse 44, not left to other people, all other dynasties will be destroyed, and it will never again fall into Gentile hands or pagan hands. This kingdom that the Lord will raise up will last forever. For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and so this stone that demolished the feet and then thus demolished the image that was cut out of the mountain without hands, this was of God. This wasn't of men's doing. This wasn't a nation or an empire that rose up and took over that was of man. It was a nation that God established, but it wasn't a nation that rose up from the seed of men and grew in dominance and grew in power and grew in military might and then takes over. No, it wasn't like that. This stone was cut out of the mountain without hands. In other words, God did it, and that it break in pieces the iron, the brass, it starts at the bottom, works its way up, the brass, the clay, the silver. At this point, I think he's going backwards over history, starting closest to the return of the Lord and going backwards through history. And he breaks down the iron and brass and clay and silver and gold. The great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. And the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. There's no question about this, Nebuchadnezzar. There is no other interpretation that you can come up with. I've told you the thoughts you had on your bed. I've told you what your dream was. I've told you, because of the grace of the God of heaven, I've told you what it means. And there's no other way to look at this. There's no other set of circumstances that we can plug in and analyze this a little different and come out with a different conclusion. This, Nebuchadnezzar, is what is going to happen. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. And the king answered unto Daniel and said, Of a truth it is, that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. And the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him many gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. And we'll pick it up next week from there. But we really won't get... Well, there's only one more verse. And Daniel requested of the king that he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. I think Daniel was the prime minister of Babylon under a pagan king. And the king said, You nailed it. You hit it perfectly. You hit the interpretation of the dream, or you hit the dream exactly. And since you were able to tell me what I was thinking, you were able to tell me what the dream was, I'm going to trust you and your God's interpretation of what the dream means. And the king was all ears, and is evidenced by what he did with Daniel in promoting him to that great elevated level, prime minister or whatever it would have been called. Daniel got the dream right. The interesting thing about this, to me, is Nebuchadnezzar saw the rise and fall of various kings and kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar saw the image of gold, thou art the head. He saw that all in the subsequent successive kingdoms after him, and all of it crushed by the stone, cut out of the mountain without hands. And yet he's not yet humbled. He seems even more puffed up. Over the next couple of chapters, he will do things that he seems even more puffed up. Now, he's going to get humbled. We know that in the end of chapter 4. But it's striking to me, the arrogance of man. He comes face to face with the future. And God revealing to him his kingdom is not going to last forever. And he's got to realize he's not. And he doesn't humble him. It just demonstrates to me the temperament of man and the self-arrogance of man. It should have humbled him. And it should humble us to realize what small pieces we are in the giant mosaic of God's world. But at the same time, being a small piece in his mosaic, I'm going to end with what I've started with a couple of weeks in a row, that Daniel was a man of uncompromising character, a godly man who endeavored to just live the book, live God's word. And that kind of man had, we called it unlimited knowledge, because his knowledge base was not of himself. His knowledge base was of God. And God could answer the questions in life that you and I can't answer. God can answer the questions of life that aren't specifically written in the Word of God. How should I do this? Where should I do this? What time frame should I do this? And so on. The questions that you and I have every day of our lives. But Daniel, being a man of uncompromising character and boldness beyond belief, and he also then has unlimited knowledge in the sense that God is his knowledge base. And with all of that in place, he has immeasurable influence. Now he's elevated to what would be second in charge of Babylon. And that could be us in the sphere of influence wherever God puts us. That God may use uncompromising, godly individuals that just look to the Lord for wisdom and direction, and the influence that we might have wherever God has us is immeasurable. It could be immeasurable. Real quick story. And my time is up, I know. One night, Saturday night, 10 o'clock at night, I'm just ready, I'm living in Washington at the time, just ready to hit the bed. I mean, I laid down and the sheets were still going, and the phone rings. And it was a person that I knew that was in trouble. And he said, I need help. And I said, what can I do? And he said, I'm in Toledo. I don't know where. My glasses have been broken, so I can't see, I can't read signs. But I need you to come get me. And I'm like, where in Toledo are you? And he said, the last I remember was here. He got beat up. The last I remember being here. And he told me what bar he was at. So I got Scott Johnson, because he's bigger than me. And I said, will you go to Toledo with me at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night? And will you help me find this guy? And let's see if we can help him. We looked all over. We looked. I've never been in many bars, but I was in a lot of bars that night, more bars than I've ever been in one day, ever. And we couldn't find the guy. In a couple places I said, well, we think we saw a guy that fits that description. It was weird. Lee Scott had a leather jacket. He looked a little like he belonged there. We walked in, everybody else goes. Place goes quiet. The whole thing is. I get back home and we gave up. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning. We gave up. Came home. I get ready to lay down and the phone rings again. And it's the same guy. And he said, where are you? And I said, well, where are you? I can't find you. And we talked a little bit. And he'd found some help. And the urgency was gone. And I said, why did you call me? How did you call me? How'd you know my number? And he said, I visited Faith Baptist Church years ago. And you gave me your business card. And said, if you ever need anything, call me. And I've kept that business card. And I needed something, and you didn't come. And I said, I tried to come. He said, I know you tried to come. I know you tried to help. You don't know how you can be a help to somebody if you make yourself available. The influence that you can have if by God's grace we try to live this book, if by God's grace we try to lean on Him for knowledge and direction, our knowledge base is unlimited and our influence is immeasurable. You just never know how you might be able to help someone. And Daniel was thrust into a position probably beyond his wildest imagination, just by being there in God's place at God's time and looking to God for direction. May God help us to do just that. And may what Nebuchadnezzar saw humble us. It is God that sets up kings and kingdoms, and God that takes them down. It's God that gives us life, and it's God that takes our life when it's time to be taken. May that humble us and give Him our best with the days that He has given to us. Let's stand.